The steel restraint buckle hit the wall hard enough to leave a dent. 3 security guards went down in under 8 seconds. Not from punches, but from controlled pressure points applied with terrifying precision. The man in the hospital bed wasn't raging anymore. He was fighting. There's a difference, and every person in that hallway at Redstone Memorial Hospital could feel it in their chest. Every nurse backed against the wall. Every orderly froze. Except one. Emily Carter, 30 years old, first night on the job, walked straight through the door. No weapon, no backup, no hesitation. What nobody in that building understood yet, not the chief physician who'd already dismissed her, not the security team scrambling for backup, not the patient destroying the room, was that the quiet transfer nurse from out of state had once done things in places that didn't appear on any map. And the man tearing apart that room wasn't having a breakdown. He was still at war. If this story already has you leaning forward, follow along, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Emily had been at Redstone Memorial for exactly 4 hours when everything broke. She'd driven into Ashford, Montana 3 days earlier with 2 duffel bags, a nursing license from a different state, and a forwarding address that was technically a storage unit. She hadn't told the hiring coordinator much. She hadn't needed to. Her credentials were legitimate, her references checked out, and rural mountain hospitals in the middle of January were not in a position to be selective about night shift nurses with ER experience. What the paperwork didn't mention, what Emily had spent considerable effort making sure the paperwork didn't mention, was the 8 years before nursing school. She'd picked up her ID badge from a bored woman at the front desk, been handed a laminated floor map, and walked through orientation in 40 minutes with a group of 3 other new employees, 2 of whom spent most of the time on their phones. The nursing director, a tired woman named Pauline Graves, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and moved like someone whose feet hurt constantly, had pointed Emily toward the 3rd floor and told her to shadow Roberta until 10 o'clock. Roberta was 53, had been at Redstone for 19 years, and made it clear within the first 20 minutes that she didn't particularly want to be shadowed. "We do things a specific way here," Roberta said, not looking up from a medication chart. "It's not wrong, it's just how we do it." "Understood," Emily said. "The last transfer we had came in thinking she could reorganize the supply system." "I'm not here to reorganize anything." Roberta looked at her for the first time. Something in Emily's tone, flat, not defensive, just settled, made the older nurse pause. "Where'd you transfer from?" "Billings Regional." "Before that?" "Travel nursing. Couple different facilities." Roberta nodded slowly, the way people do when they're deciding not to ask the obvious follow-up question. They moved on. The 3rd floor at Redstone Memorial was a mixed medical surgical unit with 12 beds and a census that, on this particular Tuesday in January, sat at 9 patients. 8 of them were unremarkable: post-surgical recovery, 1 diabetic complication, 2 respiratory cases, an elderly man with a broken hip who had been there long enough that the nurses knew his breakfast preferences by heart. The 9th patient was in room 312. His chart said Ethan Cole, 51 years old, admitted 3 days ago for what was logged as a psychiatric hold following a behavioral incident at a VA outpatient clinic 40 miles outside Ashford. The admitting diagnosis listed acute stress response with dissociative episodes. There were notes about agitation, refusal to take certain medications, verbal altercations with staff. Emily had glanced at the chart briefly, the way you do when you're new and trying to absorb everything at once without making it obvious. She'd noticed his age, the admission reason, and the medication list, which was longer than it needed to be for a man with no documented history of psychiatric illness prior to this admission. She'd filed that thought somewhere quiet and kept moving. Dr. Marcus Holt arrived on the floor at 9:15. He was the chief physician on rotation, which at a hospital the size of Redstone meant he held considerable authority over everything that happened between the hours of 8 and 8. He was in his mid-50s, carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything in a professional setting, and had a way of speaking to nursing staff that was technically polite and completely dismissive at the same time. He stopped when he saw Emily. "You're the transfer," he said. "Emily Carter." "Yes." He looked at her badge, then at her. Where'd you train? University of Colorado, BSN. Did my clinical hours at PE? Billings has a decent program. He was already moving toward a chart rack. Roberta will show you how we handle documentation here. We have specific preferences for how notes are structured. Of course. We don't improvise on this floor. He said it without turning around. I've had transfers come in and try to apply what worked somewhere else. This is a small facility. We have protocols. Emily watched his back. I understand. He walked away. Roberta appeared at Emily's elbow. Don't take it personally, she said quietly. He's like that with everyone new. He's like that with everyone female, said a younger nurse passing by with a medication tray. A woman named Danny, who had the harried energy of someone working a double shift and no longer cared what she said in front of strangers. Nobody responded to that. It wasn't a conversation anyone wanted to have at 9:15 on a Tuesday. At 10:47, room 312 came apart. Emily heard it before she saw it. A sound that wasn't quite a crash and wasn't quite a shout, something lower and more purposeful, like furniture being moved by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She was at the nurse's station reviewing chart documentation when the noise registered, and she was moving before the call light even came on. The hallway outside 312 had 3 security guards, and Roberta and 2 other nurses, all of them pressed against the wall opposite the door. Through the narrow window in the door, Emily could see the room in chaos. The bed partially overturned, the IV stand on the floor, the man who had been Ethan Cole standing in the corner with his back against the wall, breathing hard, eyes fixed on a point somewhere that wasn't the hospital room. One security guard had a bruised cheek. Another was cradling his wrist. He just went off, Roberta said. We were checking vitals and how long has he been like this? 4 or 5 minutes. We called Dr. Holt. Emily looked through the window again. She watched the way Ethan Cole was breathing, fast but controlled, not panicked. She watched his hands. They were open, not clenched. She watched his eyes, the way they moved, tracking things that weren't in the room. She knew that look. She had seen that look in other places, in other rooms, in other people who had been places that rewired the way the brain handled sudden noise and confined spaces and strangers moving too fast, too close. I'm going in, she said. Absolutely not, said the security guard with the bruised face. We're waiting for the doctor. He'll be sedated before the doctor gets here if one of you goes in there. That's not... She stopped. Just give me 2 minutes. You've been here half a shift, Roberta said. You don't know this patient. No, but I know what's happening to him. She didn't wait for permission. The room smelled like antiseptic and the particular sharp scent of adrenaline sweat. Ethan Cole registered her entry immediately. His head snapped toward the door, his weight shifted, and Emily stopped moving the moment she crossed the threshold. She didn't advance. She didn't reach for anything. She stood still, hands visible at her sides, and waited. I'm not here to restrain you, she said. Her voice was level. Not loud, not artificially calm in that practiced hospital staff way that people can always hear through, just level. My name's Emily. I'm a nurse. I'm going to stand here until you're ready. Ethan Cole stared at her. His chest was heaving. There was a cut on his forearm where he'd caught the edge of something. Not deep, but bleeding. They were trying to... He stopped, shook his head. There was someone at the door. I know it felt that way. It wasn't... I know where I am. His voice was rough, caught between 2 realities. I know I'm in the hospital, but something was wrong. Someone came in and I couldn't... Your nervous system doesn't know the difference, Emily said. Between here and there. That's not weakness. That's wiring. He looked at her. Really looked at her, for what might have been the first time since she'd entered. You've seen this before, he said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. Something in his posture shifted, not all the way down, not by a long measure, but enough. His weight settled back against the wall instead of poised on the balls of his feet. His hands, which had been open and ready, dropped a few inches. Your arm is bleeding, she said. Can I look at it? A long pause, then, yeah, okay. She moved slowly, deliberately, the way you move around something that isn't finished being dangerous. She reached him and crouched slightly to look at the cut without requiring him to extend his arm first, letting him make that choice. He extended it after a moment. The cut needed cleaning and a couple of butterfly closures, not stitches. She had what she needed in the kit she'd grabbed from the hall cart on her way in. She'd taken it without thinking, the same way she'd automatically cataloged the room layout when she entered, noted the position of every piece of furniture, identified the exits. Old habits. She worked on the cut quietly. He watched her hands. "What unit?" he said finally. She didn't answer immediately. She finished cleaning the wound, tore open a butterfly closure with her teeth, the way she'd done 1,000 times in places with no sterile scissors. "Does it matter?" she said. "Just curious?" His voice had come down considerably. There was something almost dry in it now. "You moved like someone who's been in a room that was about to go bad." "I moved like a nurse who didn't want anyone else to get hurt." He almost smiled. Almost. "Right." She closed the wound, taped it, didn't push. They existed in the room for another 30 seconds in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Then Marcus Holt walked through the door with 2 security guards and a syringe. "Step back from the patient," Holt said, not to Ethan Cole. To Emily. She stood. "He's calm. The situation is resolved. You entered this room without authorization. There wasn't time to—" "Step back." Holt's voice had the edge of someone who expected to be obeyed before the sentence finished. "Sergeant Cole, you're going to receive a sedative to—" "I don't need a sedative," Cole said. "It's protocol after an agitation episode." "I said I don't need it." Holt looked at the guards. The unspoken instruction was clear. Emily moved to the side of the bed. "Dr. Holt, his episode was a stress response, not a psychiatric break. Sedating him isn't—" "Ms. Carter." Holt turned to face her fully, and whatever thin professional courtesy had been in his expression earlier was completely gone. "You have been on this floor for less than 4 hours. You have no relationship with this patient, no authority to intervene, and no business being in this room. You did not follow protocol. You did not wait for a physician. You entered a room with a violent patient and you— He's not violent. He was frightened." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when someone says something that everyone in the room recognizes as true and nobody with authority wants to acknowledge. Holt held her gaze for 3 seconds. "I'll speak with you in the hall." The hall conversation was brief. Holt spoke. Emily did not say much. Roberta stood nearby looking at the floor. When Holt finished speaking, Emily stood still for a moment. "You're terminating me," she said, "on my first shift." "I'm terminating your contract, yes. Your conduct was unsafe and insubordinate. You'll be escorted out." He didn't need the sedative. "That is not your determination to make." A security guard appeared at her elbow. Young guy, uncomfortable with the situation, not quite meeting her eyes. Emily looked at him, then back at Holt. "Fine," she said. She walked to the nurse's station, picked up her jacket from where she'd left it on a hook, and moved toward the elevator. Roberta called after her once, just her name, quietly. Emily didn't stop. In the elevator descending, she pulled out her phone. She was thinking about the medication list she'd seen on Ethan Cole's chart. She'd only looked at it briefly, and she wished now she'd looked longer. The sedative Holt had tried to administer tonight. She knew that drug class. She knew the ceiling doses. And the chart had shown an existing order for another medication in the same family, at a dosage that was when you added them together. The elevator opened to the lobby. Emily stepped out, walked past the front desk, pushed through the glass doors into the January dark. The cold hit her face immediately, the Montana kind of cold that had weight behind it. Her breath came out in a hard plume. She stood in the parking lot and did the math again. Combined dosage. Patient weight. Approximately 190 pounds based on what she'd seen, the existing medication order, the new sedative Holt had just administered, and the third item on the chart, the one that had been there when she'd first reviewed it, and that she'd almost dismissed as an unusual but not impossible prescription choice. Almost. She stood very still. Then she got out her phone and pulled up the hospital's public directory, which she'd looked at during orientation that morning, and she found the name she was looking for. Not Holt. Someone else. She had been fired. She had no badge, no access, no authority. The security guard who'd escorted her to the elevator had her temporary ID on his belt. Emily stood in the freezing parking lot and looked up at the third-floor window of Redstone Memorial Hospital, the light there burning yellow in the dark. The fatal drug interaction she'd just calculated in her head would look, on paper, exactly like a cardiac complication secondary to an existing stress response. It would look like a patient who'd been agitated, who'd already strained his heart during the episode, whose body had simply given out. It would look like a tragedy, an unfortunate loss, a decorated veteran who'd battled his demons and lost. It would not look like murder. Emily calculated the timing. The sedative Holt had administered would peak in approximately 40 minutes. The third medication on the chart, the one that had been there before tonight's episode, the one that had been ordered by someone other than Holt, would reach its own window of maximum concentration in roughly the same period. 40 minutes. Less, maybe. Biological variables. She looked at her phone. She looked at the parking lot around her. Empty, one security light buzzing at the far end, her car sitting 30 feet away. She put the phone in her pocket. She started walking, not toward her car, toward the side entrance she'd noticed during orientation. The one with the badge reader that, per the orientation coordinator's comment, was running on backup power tonight because the main reader was due for replacement and the backup system only authenticated against the primary database once an hour. The orientation coordinator had said it as an aside about the facility's maintenance backlog, something to roll her eyes about. Emily had filed it away without deciding why. She filed things away like that. It was a hard habit to break. She reached the side door. She stood in front of the badge reader and she thought about what she was about to do. Not the ethics of it, she'd already worked through that, but the practical consequences, her nursing license, her record, the career she had built piece by piece over 5 years to have something stable to come back to. She thought about a man on the third floor whose nervous system had been rewired by the same kind of years she'd had, who was lying in a hospital bed with a drug combination building toward something no one was supposed to survive. She reached into her jacket pocket and found the lanyard she'd pulled off her neck in the elevator, the one with the temporary badge she'd told herself she forgot to hand to the security guard. She held it to the reader. The light blinked green. The door opened. Emily Carter walked back into Redstone Memorial Hospital, and somewhere on the third floor, a clock she couldn't see was already running down. The stairwell smelled like concrete and cleaning solution, and Emily took it 2 steps at a time without touching the railing. She wasn't running. Running drew attention, made noise, communicated panic to anyone who might be watching. She moved fast and quiet, the way she'd learned to move in places where the difference between those two things was the difference between walking out and not walking out. Third floor. She counted the flights automatically, hit the door, eased it open an inch before going through. The hallway was quieter than it had been an hour ago, night shift settling into its rhythm. One nurse at the station, not Roberta, someone Emily didn't recognize, head down over paperwork, a transport aide pushing an empty wheelchair toward the far end. The light outside room 312 was off, which meant no staff inside, which was either good or very bad, depending on what had happened in the 40 minutes since she'd left. She moved along the wall, keeping her pace even, her face neutral. Nobody looked up. She reached 312 and pushed through the door. Ethan Cole was in the bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The sedative had hit him. She could see it in the slight heaviness around his eyes, the way his body was settled too deep into the mattress. But he was conscious. She did a fast visual check, breathing rate, color, the visible pulse in his neck. "You came back," he said. His voice was slow, but his eyes were tracking her fine. "Don't try to sit up." She moved to the IV stand, checked the drip. The sedative was running on schedule. She looked at the secondary line, the one feeding the third medication, the one she'd been calculating in the parking lot. It was running. She followed the line to the pump, read the settings, did the math again with the actual numbers in front of her instead of approximations from memory. It was worse than she'd thought. The timing window was narrower. Whoever had set this up had accounted for the sedative, had built the dosing schedule around it, had made the whole thing look like a gradual, medically defensible decline. This wasn't improvised. Someone had planned this carefully, and they'd planned it before tonight's episode, before Holt fired her, before any of it. There's something wrong with my IV, Cole said. Not a question. Yeah. I figured. He exhaled slowly, the effort visible. I've been feeling wrong since yesterday morning, not the stress response kind of wrong, the other kind. The kind where your body's working harder than it should be. Something like that. She was already reaching for the secondary line. She needed to stop the infusion, but she couldn't just yank the line. That would flag on the monitoring system immediately, and she needed more time than that would buy her. She needed to find the order in the system, document what she was seeing, get the pharmacy records. The door opened. Emily did not move her hands. She turned her head. It was the nurse from the station, mid-30s, short hair, tired eyes. Her name tag said Killer. She looked at Emily, then at the IV stand, then back at Emily. Who are you? Keeler said. Her voice was careful, not loud. You're not on this floor? I was the transfer nurse who was terminated earlier tonight. Keeler blinked. Then you need to look at the medication pump. Emily kept her voice flat. Secondary line, running rate, then look at his chart and find the sedative Dr. Holt administered at 10:53. Add those two together with what's currently infusing and tell me what you get. A pause. Keeler didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly she crossed the room and looked at the pump. She looked at it for long enough that Emily knew she was doing the same calculation. Keeler's face changed. She stopped. Yeah. That can't be right. Dr. Holt ordered, pull the original order, check who entered it into the system and when. Check whether it was modified after it was entered. Keeler looked at her. The expression on her face was the one Emily recognized from people who were realizing something they didn't want to realize. Not disbelief exactly, more like the specific dismay of a person who'd been in the same building as something terrible and hadn't known. If I pull that order and you're wrong, if I'm wrong, you document that the off-duty terminated nurse came back and questioned a medication order, and you were right to override her concern. Emily held her gaze. If I'm right, we need to stop this drip in the next 20 minutes. Kaler stood very still for 3 seconds. Then she pulled out her badge scanner and accessed the medication order on the room's wall-mounted terminal. The silence while she read was long enough for Emily to hear Cole's breathing and the hum of the building's heating system and her own pulse in her ears. She watched Keeler's face. She watched the exact moment Keeler found it. This order was entered at 1440, Keeler said quietly, modified at 2108. She looked up. That's after the episode. After Dr. Holt was already on the floor. Who modified it? Keeler looked at the screen again, read the user ID, said nothing for a moment. Then, it's logged under Dr. Holt's credentials. But Dr. Holt doesn't modify orders himself. He dictates them. He hasn't personally entered an order into this system in 3 years. The pharmacy staff, the charge nurse, we all know that about him. Emily moved to the pump. I need to suspend this line. You don't have authorization. You do. Another beat of that specific silence. Then Keeler reached past her and suspended the infusion. The pump beeped once, softly, and went quiet. Emily exhaled. One thing at a time. I need you to print the medication history for this patient going back to admission, she said. Everything, every modification, every user stamp, every time stamp. That's going to flag the charge system. It's going to flag it anyway when someone checks the pump. I'd rather have the records in hand when that happens. Emily looked at her. You know something's wrong here. You did the math the same as I did. Keeler looked at Cole, who had been watching both of them with the particular stillness of someone conserving energy for something more important. She looked at the suspended pump. She looked at the terminal. Give me 4 minutes, she said, and started printing. What came off that printer in the next 4 minutes was not, by itself, proof of anything. Emily understood that. A modified medication order under a doctor's credentials could be a system error, a transcription mistake, any number of mundane explanations that a good attorney would spend 40 minutes on in front of a jury. What it was, by itself, was a thread. Emily had learned a long time ago that you pulled threads. She folded the printout and put it inside her jacket against her ribs. She looked at Cole. Can you walk? He looked at her steadily. Depends on where. Out of this building. Why out? Because whoever modified that order is going to know the pump was suspended in about 10 minutes, and the only reason to suspend it is if someone found out what it was doing, and the only reason to find that out on a Tuesday night in January is if a person came back to check. She held his eyes. They already tried once. They're not going to wait. Ethan Cole looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he moved, slowly, pushing himself upright against the weight of the sedative in his system. He wasn't steady. She could see that. But he was functional. Whatever he'd built over decades of conditioning didn't disappear because of a medication. It slowed down, but the architecture was still there. I need my boots, he said. Kyler, who had been watching this exchange with an expression that had moved past dismay and into something more focused, went to the small closet without being asked and found them. Emily helped him with the IV removal. Clean, controlled, pressure applied immediately. No wasted motion. Cole watched her hands. You're not just a nurse, he said. I am a nurse, she said. Among other things. They were at the door when Keeler said quietly, There's a loading dock exit on the basement level. Staff use it for break. The camera on that side has been cycling on and off for a week. Maintenance ticket's been open. She paused. I'll wait 20 minutes before I call this in. That's the best I can do. Emily looked at her. There was nothing adequate to say to a person who had just made a decision like that in a hallway at 11:30 at night without nearly enough information. Thank you, she said. Keeler nodded once, already turning back to the terminal, already constructing whatever version of events she'd be reporting in 20 minutes. The basement was cold and smelled like industrial cleaners and the particular stale air of a building that was older than its renovations. Emily had Cole's arm over her shoulders, not because he couldn't walk, but because his gait was off-center enough from the sedative that the stairs were a real problem. They moved through the service corridor, past the laundry intake and the housekeeping supply room and a locked door marked biomedical, and found the loading dock door where Kaler had said it would be. It opened to the back parking lot, the loading area, a single overhead light with a moth problem even in January. Emily's car was on the other side of the building. She didn't go for it, too exposed, and if anyone had the presence of mind to check cameras or track the badge she'd used at the side entrance, her car's location was the first thing they'd look at. She thought fast. She had cash, her personal phone, the medication records against her ribs. She had the problem of a man who was medically compromised, sedative still active, whose picture was on file with the hospital as a patient who'd left without discharge. And she had the pharmacy records from the printout, which she hadn't fully read yet. She got Cole settled on a concrete barrier at the edge of the dock, out of the direct light, and she pulled out the printout and read it quickly, her phone's flashlight on low, shielded with her hand. The medication history went back to admission. She read through 3 days of orders, looking for the pattern, the place where something shifted from medical care to something else. She found it on day 2, a pharmacist override, a dosage adjustment logged at 3 a.m. Not an unusual hour for a hospital, but the user ID attached to the override wasn't a pharmacist. It was a system account, a generic administrative login that shouldn't have had medication modification access at all. She stared at that line for a moment. A generic administrative login, which meant someone had either stolen access credentials or someone with IT-level access to the hospital's system had gotten into the pharmacy module directly. This wasn't a doctor making a bad call. This wasn't even a deliberate falsification by someone with medical credentials. Someone had hacked the system. The cold was working through her jacket, and she barely felt it. She was thinking about what it meant to hack a hospital's pharmacy module, the access level required, the planning, the specific knowledge of which medications to combine and at which dosages to produce a result that looked natural on paper. This was not improvised. This was not personal animosity or medical negligence or even a straightforward cover-up of something that had gone wrong. Someone had planned for Ethan Cole to die in this hospital in a way that would never be investigated as anything other than a tragic medical complication. They'd planned it before he was admitted, possibly before he'd been brought to the VA clinic, where the behavioral incident that triggered the hold had occurred. Emily looked up from the printout. Cole was watching her, his back against the wall, arms around himself in the cold. He'd found a jacket in the closet, His own, she assumed. He was still pale, but the sedative was visibly metabolizing. There was more sharpness in his eyes than there'd been 15 minutes ago. "What did you find?" he said. "Someone got into your medication orders through an admin system login, modified the dosage protocol on day 2. The sedative tonight was the trigger. The combination would have..." She stopped. "It would have looked like your heart gave out, secondary to the stress episode." He was quiet for a moment. "Someone went through that kind of trouble for me." "Does that mean something to you? A specific reason someone would want to make sure this particular endpoint happened in this particular way?" He looked at the parking lot. His jaw worked. "6 years ago," he said, "my team ran an operation that went wrong. 8 men. I was the only one who came back." He paused. "The official report said it was an ambush, bad intelligence, that we were in the wrong position. But I had the communication logs. I'd kept copies. Not authorized, but I kept them." His voice was flat, the flat of something that had been processed a very long time ago into something survivable. "Those logs show we weren't in the wrong position. We were put in that position. Someone gave our coordinates and our timing to the other side. Someone who knew what would happen." Emily was very still. "I've been trying to get someone to look at those logs for 4 years, Cole said. VA, DOD, Congressional Office, 3 different lawyers. 2 of the lawyers stopped returning my calls after the first meeting. One of them told me to stop, that it wasn't safe." He looked at her. "I thought I was being paranoid. I thought maybe the grief had warped my read on it." "You weren't paranoid," Emily said. "No." He exhaled slowly. "I wasn't." She put the printout back inside her jacket. Her mind was moving fast now, assembling pieces, the hacked pharmacy system, the level of access required, the kind of reach it implied, the specific targeting of a man who held communication logs that implicated someone in the deliberate deaths of 7 soldiers. This wasn't just about Ethan Cole anymore. She was still thinking through the shape of it when she heard the sound she'd been listening for without realizing it. The soft, mechanical sound of a door somewhere behind her, on the dock level. Not Keeler's 20 minutes. Not even close. She was moving before she'd consciously processed the threat, getting to Cole, pulling him to his feet because whoever had just come through that door wasn't coming to check on a suspended medication pump. You don't send someone to the loading dock for a routine check. You send someone to the loading dock because you already know exactly where the problem went. Cole was upright, not quite steady, and Emily had his arm and they were moving into the dark between the dock lights when she heard the voice, not loud, clipped, professional, saying something into a radio she couldn't fully make out. But she heard one word clearly enough. She heard her name. Her name in a stranger's mouth, on a radio, at a loading dock at 11:40 at night, meant one thing with clarity. The window she'd thought she had didn't exist. Emily pulled Cole into the gap between a parked service van and the dock's concrete retaining wall, putting the van's bulk between them and the door. She could hear 2 sets of footsteps on the dock now. Not hospital security. The cadence was wrong, too deliberate, spacing too even. Security guards moved with the loose gait of people who spent their shifts mostly bored. These 2 moved like people with a specific destination. Cole had heard it too. He was pressed against the van's side panel, breathing controlled, the sedative's weight still visible in the slight drag of his movements, but his eyes sharp. He looked at her and held up 2 fingers, questioning. She nodded. 2. He tilted his head toward the far end of the lot. She looked, a gap in the perimeter fence where a maintenance truck had been parked earlier. She'd registered it on the way in as a possible exit point without consciously deciding to. The truck was gone now. The gap remained. 60 feet of open parking lot between them and it. She looked at Cole. He was functional, but not fast. The sedative had taken the edge off his coordination, and she'd seen it on the stairs. He could move, but not quietly, not quickly, not without visible effort. 60 feet of open ground with 2 people on the dock who already knew her name was not a favorable equation. She thought for 3 seconds. Then she pulled out her phone, turned the screen brightness all the way down, and texted the only number she had available to her that might actually help. She'd entered it into her phone 6 months ago and never used it. A contact given to her by a former colleague, passed along in the specific way that people in certain communities passed along contacts, quietly, without explanation, with only the phrase if you ever need someone to pick up a call at an inconvenient hour. The text was 9 words. Redstone Memorial Ashford MT loading dock. Now. 2 hostiles. She hit send and put the phone away. The footsteps on the dock had stopped, which was worse than if they'd kept moving because it meant the 2 men had found what they were looking for, the suspended pump, maybe, or the empty bed, and were now doing the thing that people with training did when they lost a target in an enclosed space. They stopped moving and they listened. Emily controlled her breathing. Cole, beside her, had done the same without being told. The cold was significant. Montana January at midnight was the kind of cold that made prolonged stillness genuinely dangerous, and Cole was in a hospital gown under his jacket, the sedative slowing his circulation. She could feel him starting to shiver, small, controlled shivers that he was working to suppress, and suppressing shivers used energy he needed for other things. She made the call. She leaned close to his ear. When they move toward the van, we go for the fence gap. Don't wait for me to say go. I know how this works, he said, barely audible. She almost said something else. She didn't. One of the men on the dock spoke, low, into his radio again. She caught the word perimeter and the word car, and nothing else. The footsteps started again. Moving along the dock, not down into the lot yet, doing a sweep of the elevated dock level first. Professional, methodical. These were not hospital employees. The dock had 3 sets of stairs down to the lot level. She'd noted them on entry. The men were moving toward the nearest one, which put them on a vector that would sweep past the van's front end in approximately 45 seconds. Emily put her hand on Cole's arm once, lightly, felt him register it. The footsteps reached the stairs and started descending. She and Cole moved. Not running. Running on gravel in the dark made noise and broke ankles and telegraphed panic. They moved fast and low, in the shadow of the van and then across the first open stretch to the cover of a dumpster, and she could feel Cole working hard beside her, his gait compensating for the sedative's interference with his coordination, and he didn't stumble, but it was close once, and she caught his arm without slowing. 30 feet to the gap. Behind them, one of the men said something short and sharp. They'd been seen. Emily did not look back. She covered the last 30 feet in a straight line, reached the fence gap, went through sideways, and Cole came through behind her, and they were on the other side of the perimeter in the dark of the lot belonging to the adjacent medical office building, which was closed, unlit, and had a row of pine trees along its north edge that provided immediate cover. They reached the trees. Emily stopped, put her back against the largest trunk, and looked back through the fence. One of the men was at the gap. He was wearing dark clothing, no visible insignia, and he was holding a radio rather than a phone. He looked through the gap for a moment and then spoke into the radio again. Neither man came through the fence. That was interesting. That meant they had boundaries, or they had someone else covering the other side, and coming through themselves was redundant. Emily looked at Cole. He was breathing hard, hands on his knees, the sprint having cost him more than it would have without the sedative. We need to move before they reposition, she said. I know. He straightened. I'm fine. You're not fine, but you're functional, which is what matters right now. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite amusement. You always this direct? When people are trying to kill us, yeah. They moved north along the tree line, away from the hospital, into the residential edge of the block. Ashford was small, maybe 12,000 people, the kind of small city where a stranger walking fast at midnight got noticed eventually, but the streets were quiet and the nearest houses were dark. Emily's phone buzzed. She looked at it. The response to her text was 4 words. 20 minutes. Don't move. She showed it to Cole. He read it, looked at her. Who did you text? Someone who owes me a favor. Technically. It's complicated. She pocketed the phone. We need somewhere to wait that's not the street. The medical office building's parking lot had a small structure at the far corner, a covered bike shelter, 3 walls, and a roof designed for staff who didn't exist at midnight. They got there in 3 minutes, and it was out of sight lines from the street and the hospital both. Cole sat on the concrete bench, and Emily crouched in front of him and did a fast assessment. Pulse, respiration, skin temperature, responsiveness. He tolerated it without comment. "You're cold," she said. "I noticed. Pulse is a little fast. The sedative's fighting with your cardiovascular response to the cold and the exertion." "I'm not going into arrest." "No, but your body's working on it." She unzipped her jacket and handed it to him. He started to refuse, and she gave him a look that settled it. He took the jacket. She was colder immediately, but she'd been colder and she had more meat on her reserves than a man who'd been sedated and potentially undernourished for 3 hospital days. "The communication logs," she said. "Where are they?" Cole looked at her steadily. "Why?" "Because this isn't just about stopping what they tried to do tonight. Whoever is behind this, the system hack, the medication setup, the people on that dock, they're going to try again. The only thing that stops another attempt is making the logs public enough that killing you doesn't accomplish anything anymore. And you think I'm just going to hand those logs to a nurse I met 4 hours ago? I think you're going to hand them to whoever has the best chance of making them matter," Emily said. "And right now that's me, because I'm the one who's still standing between you and whatever comes next." She held his gaze. "I'm also the one who came back into that building when I didn't have to." A pause. The wind worked through the shelter's open side. "They're not physical copies," Cole said. "I got past carrying paper years ago, encrypted files stored off-site. I have access through a specific login that doesn't connect to my name." "Can you access it from a phone?" "If I have a secure browser and enough time." "I have a VPN and a clean browsing setup. Habit." She pulled out her phone. He looked at it for a moment, then took it. While he worked, she kept watch on the approaches to the shelter, monitoring the street and the distant hospital perimeter where she could see 2 sets of headlights that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. Someone was running a vehicle sweep. Organized, resourced, responding quickly to the loss of the target. This was not a couple of people acting alone on short notice. Cole handed the phone back. On the screen was a file directory, encrypted file names, a folder structure that meant nothing to her without context. "The folder marked VX6, he said. "That's the operation. Communications logs, timestamps, geolocation data from the tactical units, the initial mission briefing compared against the actual coordinates we were given." He paused. "And a financial transfer record I was sent anonymously 3 years ago. I don't know who sent it, but it cross-references a defense contractor account with the timeline of the operation." Emily looked at the folder. VX6. That's the operations designation? Vortex 6, 8-man reconnaissance team, northern sector, classified location. His voice was flat the way it had been before, processed, survivable. "The official after-action report says we were ambushed due to faulty intelligence. The logs show our coordinates were transmitted to an external network 40 minutes before we reached the position." He stopped. 7 men died in the 40 minutes after that. The weight of it sat between them in the cold. She transferred the files to a secondary location, her own encrypted backup, a system she'd set up years ago for reasons she'd never had to explain to anyone. And she was finishing that when the headlight she'd been watching resolved into a single vehicle that turned into the medical office lot and came toward them without hesitation. Emily was on her feet. The vehicle stopped 20 feet out. A dark SUV, civilian plates. The driver's door opened and a woman got out. Tall, mid-40s, short gray-streaked hair, wearing a canvas jacket that was not warm enough for this weather, moving with the brisk, no-nonsense energy of someone who had been woken up and hadn't minded. She looked at Emily and said, "You cut your hair." 2 years ago, Emily said. "Suits you." The woman looked at Cole, then back at Emily. "What's his status?" "Sedative, administered against his will, therapeutic dose range wearing off. He's cold and his cardiovascular system's stressed, but he's ambulatory and cognitively intact." "Can he travel?" "Yes." "Then let's go." The woman turned back to the SUV. "My name's Renata Voss," she said over her shoulder to Cole. "I'm not going to explain everything right now because we don't have time and Emily will catch you up. What I will tell you is that I'm Federal Military Investigative Division, and I've had a file with your name on it for 14 months. Cole stood slowly, looked at Emily. "Favor," Emily said. "Technically." They got in the SUV. Renata drove without lights until they were 3 blocks from the hospital, then flipped them on and took a route that avoided the main roads for the first 10 minutes. Not dramatically, not erratically, just the calm, deliberate navigation of someone who'd looked at a map before arriving. She had a thermos of coffee in the center console that she told Cole to drink without offering it to Emily, which Emily found both annoying and medically appropriate given Cole's presentation. "The file I have on you," Renata said, eyes on the road, started as a cross-reference from another investigation, defense contractor irregularities. "We kept finding a ghost account in the financial records, transfers that were too clean, too specifically timed, and eventually the timeline led back to a military operation 6 years ago." "Vortex 6, Cole said. Renata's eyes moved to the mirror briefly. "You know the designation." "It was my operation." A pause. Then, "How much do you have?" "Communication logs, financial cross-reference, geolocation data from the tactical units showing where we were versus where the briefing said we'd be." Renata was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed in a way that Emily recognized. The particular tightening of someone who has just received a piece of information they'd been trying to find for a long time. "The financial cross-reference. Does it name an account?" "A numbered account linked to a shell company registered in Delaware, Veriton Defense Solutions." Another silence, longer this time. "Veriton Defense Solutions," Renata said carefully, "is currently under a separate federal investigation for contract fraud related to military supply chain procurement. That investigation has been stalled for 8 months because we can't connect the financial irregularities to specific outcomes." She paused. "Specific losses of life." Emily had been listening from the back seat. "The Vortex 6 logs connect the money to the operation. If they're authentic and verifiable, yes." Renata glanced in the mirror. "They'd connect Veriton to the deliberate exposure of a military unit, which elevates contract fraud to something significantly more serious." "Conspiracy," Cole said, "against soldiers under federal protection, against a classified operation. Among other things." The SUV moved through the dark outskirts of Ashford, heading toward a highway that Emily didn't immediately recognize. She was thinking about the timeline, the hospital hack, the medication order, the 2 men on the dock who'd known her name. Renata had said she'd had a file on Cole for 14 months. "Did anyone else know you had that file?" Emily asked. Renata's jaw tightened slightly. "It's a federal investigation. There are protocols about who has access." "That's not a no." "No," Renata said. "It's not a no." Emily sat back. Someone inside the investigation knew Cole had the logs, knew he'd been trying to surface them. When that effort got close enough to being real, when he went to a congressional office maybe, or when one of the lawyers talked to the wrong person, someone upstream of the investigation decided he needed to be neutralized in a way that left no trail. "The VA clinic incident that triggered the hold," Cole said. "I didn't have an episode there. There was a confrontation. A man I didn't recognize said something that was designed to provoke a response. I kept my head. But there were witnesses, and someone filed a report that described it differently than it happened." "They manufactured the grounds for the hold," Emily said. "They needed him in a controlled medical environment," Renata said. "Somewhere they could manage access to him, somewhere a death would be medically explainable." The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. Then Renata said, "Emily, your personnel file." Emily was quiet. "I ran you when you texted me. Took about 4 minutes. Renata's voice was careful, neutral, in a specific way. "The civilian nursing record is clean. Everything before that there's a classification block I don't have access to, which at my clearance level means it's significant." "It means it's classified," Emily said. "What unit?" "I'm not going to answer that. I need to understand. You need to understand that I'm the person who has the pharmacy records showing the medication hack, the file transfer of Cole's logs, and a working knowledge of what happened tonight." Emily kept her voice even. "My personnel history isn't relevant to any of that." Renata looked at her in the mirror for a long moment. Then she returned her eyes to the road. "The men on the dock," she said. "Describe them." Emily described them. Clothing, cadence, radio equipment, the specific way the one at the fence gap had moved when he'd looked through and chosen not to pursue. Renata listened without interrupting. "Private contractors," she said when Emily finished. "Almost certainly. The pattern you're describing, the coordination, the radio protocol, the decision not to cross the perimeter even when they had a visual. That's contractor behavior. They have a defined operational scope, and they don't deviate. Someone hired them for tonight specifically, which means someone knew what was going to happen before the medication pump flagged." "The pump suspension happened at 11:20, Emily said. "They were at the dock before midnight, less than 40 minutes to deploy, locate, and move." "Prepositioned," Cole said. "They were already in Ashford," Emily agreed, waiting for a go signal. The highway opened ahead of them. Renata took the on-ramp and accelerated. "I have a secure location 40 miles out," she said. "We can establish communication with my team, get the files verified, start building the evidentiary chain." She paused. "But I need to tell you both something before we get there." Emily waited. "The investigation I've been running, I've kept it deliberately small. 2 people on my team know the full scope. After tonight, after what you've described about the contractor response time, I have to consider the possibility that there's a larger network monitoring for exactly this kind of movement." Renata's hands were steady on the wheel, but her voice had lost its earlier briskness. "If I contact my team through standard channels, we could be walking into a contained situation." "What's the alternative?" Cole asked. "We go off book tonight, establish the evidentiary chain first, get the files authenticated through a pathway that doesn't touch the federal system until we're ready to move everything at once." She exhaled. "It's slower, it's riskier in some ways, but it closes the leak before they can use it." Emily was looking at the road ahead. The dark stretch of Montana highway, the mountains invisible in the black sky, the headlights cutting maybe 100 feet of visibility. "Do you trust your 2 people?" she asked. "Yes," Renata said, without hesitation. "Then contact them through a channel that isn't standard. Personal phone, personal email, something that doesn't route through your agency's servers." Emily paused. "But you need to do it in the next 2 hours. Because the pharmacy records I have are going to surface in a formal context the moment Keeler makes her report, and when that happens, the people behind this are going to start pulling loose ends. Keeler? The nurse who helped us. She's at risk." Renata was already reaching for a second phone, a personal one, Emily noted, not the agency-issued device on the console. "I'll make the call." Cole shifted in the passenger seat. He'd been quiet for several minutes, the coffee in one hand, looking out at the dark road. He spoke without turning. 7 men, he said. "My team. I've been carrying their names for 6 years." Nobody responded to that immediately. "I just need to know," he said. "If we get this right, if the logs hold up and the financial records connect, and the whole thing goes where it needs to go." He stopped. "Does it matter? In any real way? Do the right people actually face consequences, or does it get buried in a federal proceeding for 8 years and come out the other side as a settlement with no admission of wrongdoing?" Renata said, "I can't promise you a specific outcome." "I'm not asking for a promise." Emily said, "It matters. The logs matter. What happened to your team matters. The outcome depends on how well we build this." She held his gaze when he turned to look at her. "So we build it right." He looked at her for a moment, then turned back to the road. Renata made her calls. Emily sat in the back and reviewed the transferred files on her phone, working through the structure of Cole's documentation. And the more she read, the larger the architecture became. Vortex 6 was not an isolated operation. The communication logs referenced 3 other designations in passing, operational names she didn't recognize, and the financial cross-reference Cole had received anonymously included transactions that spanned nearly a decade. Whatever had happened to Ethan Cole's team was not Veritan Defense Solutions' first time. It was the one that had left a witness. She was deep in a financial ledger spreadsheet, columns of numbers that meant nothing without the account key, but the timestamps and the amounts formed a pattern she could feel even without decoding. When Renata said quietly, "Okay, just that. One word." Emily looked up. "My people are moving," Renata said. "Secure channel, separate location. They'll have independent verification resources available in 3 hours." She was silent for a moment. "Emily, the block on your personnel file. I made a call about that too." Emily went still. I didn't go through official channels, Renata said quickly. Personal contact, someone who owes me more than a favor, let's say. She glanced in the mirror. The block on your file is a Tier 4 classification. Your service record is sealed under a Special Operations Program designation that was active from Renata. Emily's voice was quiet but final. Renata stopped. I know what my record says, Emily said. It's not why I'm here. A pause. No, Renata said, but it's why you could do what you did tonight. And it's why, when we get to the end of this, your testimony is going to carry weight that nobody in that hospital anticipated when they looked at your badge. Emily didn't answer. The headlights swept around a long curve, and when they straightened out, the road ahead was empty and dark for as far as she could see. Then her phone buzzed. Not a message. A call. An unknown number, Montana area code, and that alone was enough to pull her straight because she'd given this number to no one tonight except the people in this vehicle and Keeler who had a specific reason not to be calling right now. She answered. The voice on the other end was not Keeler's. It was male, calm, and it said, Ms. Carter, we have the nurse, the one who helped you leave. I need you to understand that what happens to her in the next 2 hours depends entirely on whether you make the right decision about where those files go. The line stayed open. Emily did not speak. She held the phone and she looked at the back of Renata's headrest, and she made herself breathe through the thing that had just happened in her chest, the cold drop of it, the specific weight. And she held it together because holding it together was the only way to be of any use to anyone. Renata had heard. She was already slowing the vehicle, already reaching for her agency phone. Cole turned around in the passenger seat and looked at Emily, and his face said what nobody in the car was saying, that the perimeter of this thing was larger than they'd thought, that the reach was longer, that the people who had tried to kill him quietly in a hospital bed were not limited by the geography of one Montana county or the staffing of one loading dock, and that somewhere in Ashford, a woman named Keeler, who had looked at a medication pump and made a choice, was now paying for it. Emily put the phone back to her ear. Tell me what you want, she said. The voice on the phone was patient in a way that felt practiced, not calm the way someone calm actually sounds, more like calm that had been constructed, the specific tone of a person who had rehearsed this kind of call before and knew that the first thing you did was let the silence work for you. Emily didn't let it work. Keeler doesn't know anything, she said. She suspended a pump based on a medication calculation. That's the sum of her involvement. She printed records, the voice said. She made choices. We're past debating her level of involvement. What do you want? The files Sergeant Cole has been carrying, the communication logs, the financial cross-reference, all of it transferred to an address I'll provide in the next 90 minutes. When we've verified receipt and confirmed the files are complete and uncopied, you'll let her go, Emily said. That's correct. She said nothing for a moment. In the front seat, Renata had stopped the vehicle on the highway shoulder and was typing rapidly on her agency phone with one hand, her personal phone already to her ear. Cole had turned fully around and was watching Emily with an expression that was very still. I need to reach out to Sergeant Cole, Emily said into the phone. Confirm he's willing. You have 15 minutes to call this number back with an answer. The line went dead. Emily lowered the phone. The highway was empty in both directions, the mountains somewhere out in the dark beyond the headlights' reach. They have Keeler, she said, to the vehicle. Not to either of them specifically, just stating the shape of it. I heard, Renata said. She finished her typing, put down the agency phone, kept the personal one at her ear. Into it, she said, run the area code, Montana 506 prefix. Cross-reference any active contractor presence in Ashford County in the last 2 weeks. She listened, pulled the phone down. My people are on it. 90 minutes isn't enough time to find her, Emily said. No, Renata agreed. It isn't. Cole said, give them what they want. Both women looked at him. Give them the files, he said. His voice was the same flat register he'd used when he talked about the operation, about the 7 men. About 6 years of trying to get someone to listen. Get Keeler out. If we hand those files over, Renata said carefully, we lose the evidentiary chain, everything we'd be building tonight, the authentication, The financial cross-reference, the connection to Veriton, it disappears. I know that. Ethan, Emily kept her voice even. We've already transferred the files. They're in my encrypted backup. Handing over Cole's original access doesn't eliminate what we already have. A pause. Cole looked at her. They don't know about the transfer, she said. They know Cole has logs. They don't know I have copies because the transfer happened 40 minutes ago on a phone they don't have access to. She held his gaze. We give them the original access credentials. We buy Keeler's release, and we spend the time between now and whenever they verify receipt building the case from what I already pulled. The highway was silent except for the engine idling. How long will verification take them? Cole said. If they're thorough, 2-3 hours minimum. The files are structured to look clean, but there's a lot of data. They'll want to confirm nothing is tagged, no embedded tracking. She paused. That's our window. Renata was already back on her personal phone. How long to authenticate what we have from our end? She said into it. Listened. Her expression didn't change, but something around her eyes tightened. Make it faster. She hung up. Looked at Emily. 90 minutes? Maybe 2 hours? Then we need to be done before they figure out the files they're receiving are real, but no longer exclusive. Emily picked up her phone. I'm calling back. She dialed. The voice picked up before the second ring. We'll transfer the access, Emily said. But I need proof of life first. I need to hear Keeler's voice. A pause, then muffled movement, and then a voice that was trying very hard not to sound frightened, and not entirely succeeding. This is Keeler. Are you hurt? No. A breath. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. Stop. None of this is your fault. Emily kept her voice steady, factual, the way she'd spoken in that hospital room earlier tonight when a man's nervous system was at war with itself. We're getting you out. Keep your head down and don't give them anything to react to. The original voice came back. Satisfied? Give me the transfer address. He did. She wrote it down on the back of the pharmacy printout she still had inside her jacket. Then she looked at Cole, who was already pulling up his phone with the secondary login, the one that would give a recipient access to the files without triggering the primary encryption layer, giving them the real files exactly as promised, just not the only copy. He transferred the credentials. They sat on the highway shoulder and waited. Renata worked her phones. Cole sat with his coffee gone cold. Emily watched the road in both directions and thought about Keeler, about the quality of her voice on the line, about what it cost a person to be sitting somewhere unfamiliar in the dark, being used as leverage in something they'd stumbled into by doing the right thing. She thought about that a lot, actually. The specific cost of doing the right thing at the wrong moment. She'd spent years thinking about it. 22 minutes after the transfer, her phone rang. Same number. We have the files, the voice said. I want Keeler released in the next 10 minutes. Location confirmed by her personally. That's the arrangement, Emily said. You have what you came for. Release her, and we're done. A silence that lasted long enough to be a conversation happening offline, with someone else, someone above the voice on the phone, in whatever structure this was operating in. Then, she'll be released at the corner of Granger and 5th in Ashford. 20 minutes. 10. Another pause. 15. Fine. She hung up. Looked at Renata. Granger and 5th, Ashford, 15 minutes. Renata relayed it on her personal phone. Her people were already in Ashford. Emily hadn't asked when they'd arrived, but the fact of it was reassuring in the way that having backup was always reassuring even when you knew it might not matter. Emily, Renata's voice had changed register slightly. While they're verifying those files, we have maybe a 2-hour window before they realize the situation is more complicated than they thought. After that, the priority calculation for these people shifts. I know. The contractor who called you, whoever is directing this, has resources and reach inside federal channels. Once they know the files are out of their control, they're going to move to protect themselves, which means destroying other evidence, calling in favors, and, depending on how exposed they feel, discrediting anyone who might testify, Emily said. Or worse, Cole said from the passenger seat, then we don't give them 2 hours. Both women looked at him again. You said your people can authenticate in 90 minutes, he said to Renata. Emily said the verification on their end takes 2 to 3 hours. So there's a window where the files are authenticated on our side, but they don't yet know we have copies. He looked at Renata steadily. That's when you move, not after, before they finish. Renata looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her agency phone, the official one, and made a call that she didn't put on speaker. Emily listened to her side of it. The language was formal, procedural, and increasingly specific. She was talking to someone above her in the federal structure, Emily gathered, but not someone connected to the leak, someone she trusted, someone she'd apparently been waiting to call until she had enough to justify the conversation. She talked for 6 minutes. When she hung up, she said, Federal arrest warrants are going to require more than 90 minutes, regardless of how fast the authentication moves. But I have authorization to pursue emergency evidence preservation through a parallel channel, which means we can lock the financial records and the communication logs into a protected federal evidence chain before anyone with access to the investigation can touch them. She paused. That protection kicks in the moment the filing goes through. After that, destroying or hiding evidence becomes obstruction on top of everything else. When does the filing go through? As soon as my team completes authentication and sends the packet. Renata's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that Emily recognized. The particular tension of a person who had been carrying a thing for a long time and could now see the outline of putting it down. 1 hour, maybe less if the files are as clean and structured as they appear. The 15 minutes passed. Renata's people confirmed Kaler had been released at Granger and Fifth, visibly shaken and with a cut on her wrist from where she'd apparently pulled against a restraint, but upright and coherent. She'd been put in the back of a vehicle belonging to Renata's team and was on her way to a safe location. Emily received a text from Renata's operative with a photo. Keeler in the back seat, looking directly at the camera with the expression of someone who had just survived something they hadn't signed up for. Her face was pale and her eyes were too bright, but she was there and she was whole. Emily looked at the photo for a moment. Then she put her phone away and said, Let's go. Renata drove. They made the 40 miles to the secure location in under an hour, a property that turned out to be a former ranger station, now maintained by some federal provision Emily didn't ask about, with enough equipment inside to make the space functional and an exterior dark enough to be invisible from the road. Renata's 2 people were already there. A man named Breck, who was younger than Emily expected, and moved with the focused efficiency of someone still early enough in the work to find it clarifying, and a woman named Harlow, who said almost nothing and spent the first 30 minutes running the transferred files through an authentication process on equipment that Emily didn't recognize the model of. Cole sat at a table with a blanket someone had found and a cup of coffee that was hot, and Emily sat across from him and did not fill the silence with anything unnecessary. You really won't tell me what unit, he said eventually. No. I'm not asking to compare notes. I'm asking because what you did tonight in that room, the way you moved in the parking lot, the way you think under pressure. He looked at her. Someone put work into making you that way. Significant work. And you walked away from it and became a nurse. I became a nurse because I wanted to save people instead of... She stopped. The work changed. I needed the work to change. He was quiet for a moment. Does it feel different? The saving part? She thought about it honestly, which she didn't usually let herself do. Sometimes it feels like the same motion, like the outcome is different, but the mechanism is the same. She looked at her hands. And sometimes it feels completely different, and that's better. When it feels like that. Cole nodded slowly. I understand that. She believed him. Harlow looked up from the equipment. Authentication is complete on the financial cross-reference and 60% of the communication logs. The remaining logs are processing. She looked at Renata. The financial records are clean, internally consistent, and the account structures match known Veriton subsidiaries that are already in the fraud investigation database. Match or link, Renata said. Link, direct transactional link, timestamped to within the operational window of Vortex 6. The room was very quiet for a moment. How direct? Emily asked. A transfer originating from a Veriton subsidiary account to a financial intermediary, shell company, registered in the Cayman Islands, On the same day, the operational coordinates were transmitted to the external network. Harlow's voice was professional, careful, the voice of someone who understood that what she was saying had weight. The amount transferred is consistent with a contracted intelligence provision payment. Cole said, "Someone sold my team's position." "The financial evidence supports that conclusion." "Yes." Harlow's voice was not unkind. "I'm sorry." He absorbed it. It wasn't new information. He'd believed it for 6 years. But there was something different about hearing it confirmed by someone who had no reason to say it, except that the numbers said it was true. Emily watched his face and saw the thing that happens when a person's long-held conviction stops being a conviction and becomes a fact. It wasn't relief. It was heavier than that. Renata was already on the agency phone, filing, Emily gathered, the emergency evidence preservation order, the protected chain, the thing that would lock what they had into a federal system before anyone connected to the leak could reach it. Breck, who had been on his laptop since they'd arrived, looked up. "I've been running the contractor identifications from Emily's description of the dock team, cross-referencing with known private security contractors active in Montana and with flagged personnel from a DoD watch list." He looked at Renata. The radio protocol she described, specific cadence, the perimeter hold behavior, matches operational signature for a group called Harwick Group. Private security, incorporated 3 years ago, majority of their contracts with a holding company that connects to Veriton, Emily said. A subsidiary of Veriton, yes. The architecture was complete. Not all the details, though. There were names still missing, faces she didn't have. The specific individual inside Renata's investigation who had passed the information that had brought Harwick Group to Ashford County on a January night, but the structure was there. Veriton had sold the coordinates of Ethan Cole's team 6 years ago. They'd spent 6 years managing the fallout, which had included tracking the one survivor with logs that could prove it. When that survivor had gotten close enough to surfacing the truth, Veriton had contracted Harwick to manage the problem cleanly. A psychiatric hold, a hospital stay, a medication protocol that would kill a man and look like a tragedy. And a terminated nurse who'd done the math in a parking lot had walked back through a side door and pulled the thread. "Renata," Emily's voice was quiet. "The leak inside your investigation. When you file the preservation order, they'll know." "Yes." "How long before they move to protect themselves?" "Hours," Renata said. "Less, maybe. Depends on how well positioned they are." She met Emily's eyes. "I'm filing regardless. The moment I delay to protect the investigation's internal integrity, I'm making the same calculation that's kept this buried for 6 years. Emily nodded. "Okay. But there's something I need from you before I file," Renata said. "On record. A formal statement of what you witnessed tonight. The medication order, the hack evidence, the contractors, all of it. It needs to be dated and time-stamped before the filing, so there's no question about the sequence." "Now?" "Now." Emily sat at the table across from Breck, who set up a recording device that was smaller than she expected, and she gave her statement. It took 23 minutes. She was precise, chronological, unemotional about the parts that were factual, and accurate about the parts where her judgment had been involved. She described the medication chart, her calculation, the pharmacy records Kaler had printed, the contractors on the dock, the file transfer, the ransom call, the release of Kaler. When she got to her own history, the part Renata had flagged, the classification block, she said, "Prior military service. Classification level not relevant to the events described." Breck glanced at Renata. Renata gave him a look that said, "Let it go," and he did. Cole gave his statement after. His was longer, 41 minutes. He was methodical in the way of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in his head for 6 years without knowing if he'd ever actually have it. And when he described the operation and the 7 men and the coordinates and what the logs showed, his voice stayed level the whole time. Emily sat against the wall behind the camera and watched his face and thought about what that cost, the level of that. When he finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "I want their names in the record. The 7. Breck looked at Renata. "Say them," Renata said. Cole said them. 7 names, one at a time, with the same care you'd use for something that mattered. Renata filed the preservation order at 2:17 in the morning. For approximately 20 minutes, nothing happened, which was itself a kind of answer. The filing had gone through, the chain was locked, and whoever was monitoring for exactly this kind of movement was processing what it meant. Then Breck's laptop made a sound. He looked at it, and something in his posture changed. "We have movement," he said. "The investigation system. There's an access attempt on the Vortex 6 case files from a credentialed user." He looked up. "Someone inside the investigation is trying to pull the financial records out of the evidentiary chain. They're hitting a preservation block." "Can they break it?" Emily asked. "No, once it's filed and time-stamped, the block is federal and hard-coded. They can't touch the evidence, they can't delete the chain, they can't modify anything." He paused. "But they can see what's in it, and they're looking." "They're figuring out what they're facing," Renata said. The credentialed access attempt lasted 4 minutes and then stopped, which was worse than if it had kept going, because stopping meant a decision had been made, and the only decision left to make when you couldn't reach the evidence was what to do about the people who'd put it there. Emily's phone rang. Unknown number, different area code from the earlier call. She looked at it. Cole looked at her. She answered. The voice was different this time, older, more measured, the kind of flat authority that came from decades of practice rather than construction, not a contractor, not a middle layer. This voice was the thing above all of it. "Miss Carter," it said, "I think it's time we spoke directly." She kept her own voice even. "I'm listening." "You're a careful person," it said. "Careful, thorough, and you clearly have support I didn't anticipate." A pause. "I'd like to propose a conversation about how this situation resolves in a way that minimizes damage for everyone involved." "Everyone involved," Emily said, "includes 7 dead soldiers. Those men died in a military operation. The circumstances were documented," Emily said, "in a federal evidence chain filed 40 minutes ago." She let that land. "Whatever you were calling to offer, it's too late. The evidence is locked, the statements are on record, and the only conversation left is the one your attorney is going to have with a federal prosecutor." A very long pause. "You should understand," the voice said, with the particular edge of someone recalibrating, "that careers have consequence, that the people involved in this investigation, federal employees, their futures, their families, are subject to certain pressures that—" "Stop," Emily said. She said it the way she'd once said it to someone in a much darker place than a ranger station in Montana, and the authority in it came from the same source it always had. Not volume, not rank, just the specific clarity of a person who had already decided. "Stop," she said again. "You're describing a threat to federal investigators on a call that Renata Voss of the Federal Military Investigative Division has been recording for the past 3 minutes. She looked at Renata, who was holding up her agency phone to confirm. "Anything else you'd like to add to the record?" The line went dead. The room was quiet. Harlow broke it first. "Authentication complete on the full log set." She looked at Renata. "Everything holds. The communication logs, the financial records, the geolocation data. It's a complete evidentiary package." Breck added, "And I've just flagged the threat call through the agency's emergency escalation system. That's automatic federal documentation." Renata stood very still for a moment, her hand at her side with the agency phone in it. Then she made the call Emily had been waiting for her to make, the one that wasn't to her 2-person team, the one that was to the level above her, the level that had authority to move on arrest warrants in the middle of the night, when the evidence was clean and the threat had been made on record. She spoke for 8 minutes. When she hung up, she said, "Federal arrest teams are being dispatched to 4 locations. 2 Veritan executives, the internal investigator who attempted evidence access tonight, and Dr. Marcus Holt." The name landed differently than the others. Emily had almost forgotten about Holt in the larger architecture of the night, which was its own kind of thing. That a man who had fired her 4 hours ago with the comfortable authority of someone who had never been seriously wrong was now one name on a list being read to a federal dispatch team at 2:30 in the morning. "Holt was the point of access," Renata continued. "His credentials were used to modify the medication order, not by him, but by someone who had access to his system login. Which means either Holt was complicit or his credentials were compromised, and either way he's material." "He knew," Cole said from the table. Everyone looked at him. He knew what was in my chart, Cole said. He administered the sedative with full knowledge of what was already running. Maybe he didn't pull the trigger on the hack, maybe someone else used his login, but when he walked into my room tonight, he knew what that sedative was going to do. His statement will determine that, Renata said. His statement. Cole's voice was very flat. He fired a nurse for saving my life and then walked into my room with a syringe. I know. The flatness in Cole's voice wasn't anger. It was the thing that lives on the other side of anger after you've spent 6 years in it. A kind of exhausted precision, the feeling of having finally arrived somewhere you'd been traveling toward for a very long time and finding it exactly as bleak as you'd imagined. Emily understood that feeling. She stood and walked to the window. The Montana dark was total. No ambient light from Ashford at this distance, nothing but the tree line and the stars. She looked at it for a moment and thought about the next step, which was the testimony. The formal testimony, the one that would happen in a federal proceeding with attorneys present and a record that would outlast this night considerably. The one where her personnel file would come up. The one where the classification block would be explained or not explained, or would require an explanation she'd spent years not giving. She heard Cole's voice behind her. You're thinking about what comes next. Yes. It's going to be complicated. Yes. The testimony, the proceedings, your record. He paused. Whatever you walked away from. She didn't answer right away. She watched the dark outside the window. Are you going to walk away from this too? He said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. She turned around. The room was lit by laptop screens and a single overhead light, and the 3 federal investigators and the decorated veteran and the woman who had walked back into a hospital with a borrowed ID badge were all in the same space at 2:40 in the morning, and the evidence was locked, and the warrants were moving, and there was still a long way to go. No, she said. She meant it. Renata's phone rang. She answered it, listened for 15 seconds, and the expression on her face was one Emily hadn't seen on her yet. Something that was not quite alarm and not quite satisfaction, but lived in the space between them. She lowered the phone. The arrest team that went to Marcus Holt's home, she said. Everyone waited. He's not there. The house is empty. Car's gone. Renata looked at Emily. His access badge was used at Redstone Memorial 6 minutes ago. The hospital. Holt had gone back to the hospital. Emily was already moving toward the door, and she was thinking about what was at Redstone Memorial at 2:40 in the morning that Marcus Holt would risk everything to reach. Not patients, not records, because the records were in a federal evidence chain now, and touching them would only compound the exposure. Not records, witnesses. She thought about who was still on that floor, who had seen what tonight, who had been present in the hallway when Emily had walked into room 312 and done the thing that started all of this. She thought about Roberta, who had been there from the beginning, who had watched everything and said almost nothing and had looked at the floor when Holt told Emily to leave. Roberta, who had been at Redstone Memorial for 19 years. Roberta, who knew things. Emily reached the door of the ranger station and pulled it open to the January dark, and behind her she heard Renata already calling the dispatch team back, redirecting them, and she heard Cole push his chair back from the table, and she knew without turning around that he was on his feet. She stepped outside. The cold hit her like a wall, immediate and total, and the stars overhead were the kind of clear that only happened when the temperature dropped below 0, and she stood on the steps for 2 seconds, thinking about Holt at the hospital with his access badge and whatever he thought he was going to accomplish, and whether she was right about Roberta, and whether right or wrong it mattered because the only thing worse than being right about this was being wrong and finding out too late. Renata appeared beside her with the SUV keys already in hand, and Emily got in the passenger side this time, and Cole folded himself into the back, and the engine turned over, and they were moving before the doors were fully closed. 40 miles back to Ashford. 40 miles, and somewhere in the middle of them, Renata's phone buzzed with a text that she handed to Emily without comment because she was driving. Emily read it. The text was from Breck, back at the station, and it said, "Second access attempt on the evidence chain. Different credentials this time. The login belongs to a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Name is Warren Price. This is bigger than Veritan. Emily looked at the name. Warren Price. A name from a level she had not anticipated, a level that meant the reach of this thing went higher and further than a defense contractor and a small Montana hospital. A level that meant the people who had sold Ethan Cole's team 6 years ago had not just done it for money, but had done it with the protection of someone who had the kind of access to make problems disappear and had been making them disappear ever since. And Warren Price, whose credentials had just attempted to breach a federal evidence chain at 2:50 in the morning, now knew exactly how much was in that chain. Emily looked at the road ahead and thought about 40 miles and what was waiting at the end of them. And she thought about the name Price and what someone at that level did when they realized the net was closing. And she thought about Marcus Holt at the hospital with his access badge at 2:40 in the morning. And something about those two things in the same moment did not feel like coincidence. It felt like the last move of a plan she hadn't fully seen yet. The 40 miles back to Ashford felt shorter than they should have, the way distances compress when the mind is already at the destination. Emily held Breck's text on her phone and thought about Warren Price. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense was not a name that showed up in pharmacy records or hospital medication logs. It was a name that showed up in the layer above all of that, the layer where decisions were made about which operations were authorized and which outcomes were acceptable and which survivors were problems. A man at that level didn't hire contractors directly. He made a call to someone who made a call, and things happened at the end of a chain long enough that his hands never touched anything. Except tonight, his credentials had touched a federal evidence chain at 2:50 in the morning, and that was the kind of thing that happened when a careful man became desperate, and careful, desperate men were more dangerous than careless ones because they were still thinking. "Price," she said, "what do you know about him?" Renata kept her eyes on the road. Warren Price has been at the DoD for 11 years. Before that, private sector. Defense consulting, which is where the Veritan connection would have been established. He sits on 2 oversight committees for classified military operations. She paused. He would have had authority to approve the operational parameters for Vortex 6. And to adjust those parameters, Cole said from the back seat. Yes. So he didn't just know about it, Cole said. He signed off on it. The evidence will determine what he signed and when, but the credential access tonight suggests he knows exactly what's in those files and what it means for him personally. Renata's voice was level, but her hands on the wheel were gripping harder than the road conditions required. A man at his position doesn't breach a federal evidence chain in the middle of the night unless he's out of options. Emily looked at the road. Or unless he thinks he has one option left. Which is? The same one they've been using for 6 years, Emily said. Eliminate the witness. Not Cole this time. They can't get to Cole now, not without making everything worse. But testimony requires more than files. It requires people who were present, people who can speak to what they saw. She looked at Renata. Holt at the hospital isn't about records. Price knows the evidence chain is locked. This is about Roberta. Renata picked up her agency phone without taking her eyes off the road and said into it, I need a unit at Redstone Memorial Hospital in Ashford, 3rd floor, now. Potential witness in danger. Nurse, first name Roberta, last name. She looked at Emily. Stills, Emily said. Roberta Stills. Stills. Yes, now. She put the phone down. They drove. The outskirts of Ashford came up faster than Emily expected. The first gas station, the first intersection with a working traffic light, the residential blocks with their dark windows. Renata ran 2 red lights without hesitation, and Emily didn't comment on it. Redstone Memorial appeared ahead, lit up the way hospitals always were at 3 in the morning, that particular yellow that made everything look slightly unwell. Renata pulled into the main lot at speed, and they were out of the vehicle before it fully stopped, Cole included, moving with more steadiness than he'd had 2 hours ago. The sedative had largely metabolized now, leaving him tired but functional. The front entrance. Emily hit the door first. The lobby was the specific quiet of a hospital night. 1 person at the front desk, a security guard at the far end, fluorescent lights humming over empty waiting chairs. The desk attendant looked up when they came through the door and clocked Renata's badge as she held it up without breaking stride. Third floor, Renata said. Any reports of a disturbance? Dr. Marcus Holt. Has he been on this floor tonight? The attendant reached for her keyboard. His badge was used at the third floor elevator at 241. Has anyone called down from that floor in the last 20 minutes? A check. No, which meant either nothing had happened yet or something had happened and no one on the floor knew it warranted a call. Emily was already at the elevator. The doors opened and the three of them got in and Renata was on her phone again, coordinating with the unit she'd dispatched, getting a location. They were 2 minutes out, coming from the east side of the building. 2 minutes was not nothing. The elevator opened to the third floor. The hallway was quiet. Same configuration Emily had memorized during her 4 hours on this floor. Nurses stationed to the left, rooms along both walls, the break room at the far end. The station was unmanned, which was wrong. Even at 3 in the morning, the station had someone. Emily moved left without discussion. The break room door was closed and she could see light under it, which was different from how it had been when she'd passed it earlier tonight. She reached it and pushed it open. Roberta Stills was sitting in a chair at the break room table, her hands flat on the surface, her face very controlled in the way of someone doing the work of staying controlled. She was still in her scrubs. Her eyes went to Emily the moment the door opened, and something in them shifted. Not relief exactly, something more complicated than that. Marcus Holt was standing on the other side of the table. He looked different than he had at 10:53, when he'd told Emily to step back from the patient with the easy authority of a man whose authority had never been seriously challenged. He still had his coat on, the outdoor coat, the one he'd put on when he left his house. His hair was disheveled in a way that was inconsistent with the person she'd spent 4 hours watching manage his professional presentation. And his hands, which had been steady and certain when they'd held a syringe, were not steady now. He turned when the door opened. He looked at Emily, then at Renata's badge, then at Cole, whom he had last seen sedated in a hospital bed. Something crossed his face that Emily had no particular satisfaction in seeing, because it wasn't the face of a villain caught dramatically in the act. It was the face of a man who had made a series of decisions over a long period of time and was only now in this break room processing the full weight of all of them landing at once. He looked diminished. He looked frightened. He looked for the first time like someone whose certainty had completely left him. "Dr. Holt," Renata said, "I'm placing you under federal detention pending formal arrest." He didn't run. He didn't argue. He sat down in the nearest chair with the slow, heavy movement of a person whose legs had made the decision before his mind did, and he put his hands on the table, and he looked at them. "I didn't," he started. "Don't," Emily said. Not loudly, not with any of the heat that would have been justified. He looked up at her. "Whatever you're about to say," she said, "say it to the federal attorney, not to me, not in front of her." She looked at Roberta when she said the last part. Roberta was looking at Holt with an expression that had been building for 19 years, Emily suspected. Not shock, not quite. Something more like the final confirmation of a thing you'd half known and spent a long time choosing not to examine. The federal unit arrived 4 minutes later, 2 agents who came up the stairwell rather than the elevator and appeared at the break room door with a particular economy of movement that came from people who did this regularly. Holt was processed with minimal drama. He stood when asked, he complied with what was asked of him, and he walked out of the break room between the 2 agents without looking at anyone in the room. The third floor of Redstone Memorial was very quiet after that. Roberta hadn't moved from her chair. Renata stepped out to coordinate with her team, and Cole stood in the doorway, and Emily sat down across from Roberta. The way you sit when you're not sure what the other person needs, but you know that leaving isn't the right call. "He came to ask me what I'd seen tonight," Roberta said finally. "What I'd told anyone." "Did you?" "I told him I'd been at the station all evening and I didn't know what he was talking about." She looked at her hands. "I've been a nurse for 31 years. I know how to look like I don't know something." "Were you scared?" Roberta looked at her directly. "Yes." No qualification on it. "I was scared before he got here, actually. I've been scared since 10:53 tonight when I watched you walk back into this building after he'd thrown you out." She stopped. "I knew something was wrong with that patient. I've known something was wrong on this floor for a week. The medication protocols for room 312 were, they didn't look right to me. I told myself I was overthinking it. You weren't. No. A pause. No, I wasn't. She looked at the table. I've worked under Marcus Holt for 11 years. He wasn't always... She stopped again. Or maybe he was. Maybe I just didn't know who to compare him to. Emily didn't have anything to offer on that, so she didn't try. Are you going to be all right? She asked instead. Roberta looked at her steadily. I've been a nurse for 31 years, she said again. Different emphasis this time. I'll be all right. Emily nodded. She believed her. The hours that followed were the kind that don't make it into any version of the story anyone tells later. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the long procedural work of what happens after the acute crisis resolves. Federal agents took statements. Renata coordinated between 3 teams across 2 time zones. Brecken Harlow, still at the ranger station, continued the authentication work and built the evidentiary packet that would support the arrest warrants and the charges. Emily gave a second formal statement, more detailed than the first, covering the break room and Holt's presence and the specific things Roberta had said about the medication protocols for room 312 going back a week, which extended the documentation of intent. Cole sat in the hospital's family waiting area, an irony nobody commented on, and drank bad coffee and was medically evaluated by a federal physician who had been called in for exactly this purpose and who confirmed what Emily had assessed: sedative metabolized, cardiovascular system stressed, but intact. No lasting physiological harm from the night's events. You're going to be sore tomorrow, the physician said. I'm sore now, Cole said. That too. It was past 5 in the morning when Renata sat down next to Emily in the waiting area and said quietly, Warren Price was taken into federal custody 40 minutes ago. His home, in Virginia, 2 agents. She paused. He didn't run. He opened the door in his bathrobe and looked at them and said, I've been expecting this. Emily absorbed that. For how long? Unknown. Could mean the last 3 hours. Could mean longer. Renata looked tired in a way that suited her better than her professional composure had, Emily thought. More real, more present. The 2 Veritan executives were taken in simultaneous operations. One in Phoenix, one in Seattle. No resistance. She paused. The Harwick Group operatives, the ones from the dock, we have names and last known locations. It'll take longer, maybe a few days, but they're not going anywhere they can disappear to. And the internal investigator, the one who accessed the evidence chain, suspended and detained pending formal charges. His full access history is being reviewed, which is going to implicate a number of things we haven't fully mapped yet. Renata folded her hands. This is going to be a long proceeding, Emily. I want you to understand that. Months of federal process, testimony, cross-examination, attorneys whose job is to make the evidentiary chain look complicated. It's not going to be clean. I know. Your personnel file is going to be part of it. The classification block is going to be challenged by defense attorneys who want to undermine your credibility as a witness by arguing you have a background that hasn't been fully disclosed. Emily looked at the waiting room. Beige walls, a stack of magazines nobody had touched, a window with the first pale suggestion of dawn starting to happen somewhere behind the mountains. Then it gets disclosed, she said. Renata looked at her. Whatever I need to put on record to make the testimony hold, Emily said. We do that, she paused. Those 7 men deserved better than what happened to them. Their families deserved the truth 6 years ago. That's worth more than a classification block. Renata was quiet for a moment. The people who trained you, they trained me to make judgment calls, Emily said. This is a judgment call. Cole had heard. He was 3 seats away and he hadn't been visibly listening, but his head had turned slightly, and Emily knew his hearing, like most things about him, was better than the sedative had made it look. He said, You don't have to. I know, she said. I'm going to anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the window, at the dark that was just beginning not to be completely dark. 7 men, he said. Diaz, Petrov, Walling, Okafor, Marsh, Trent, Beaumont. The names again. He said them the way you said things you'd been carrying until saying them became the only way to put them down. They had people, families, kids, some of them. I've been in contact with two of the families over the years. I told them what I believed, but I couldn't prove it, and the official report was all they had. He stopped. They're going to hear about this. Yes, Renata said. Notification protocol will include the families of all personnel listed in the Vortex 6 operation, before any public disclosure. She paused. That's something I can ensure. Cole nodded once. He didn't say anything else, but the thing Emily had seen in his face during the authentication, that heavy arrival at a long-traveled destination, had shifted into something that didn't have a clean name. Not peace, too early for that, and peace was probably not what a man who'd lost 7 friends ever fully arrived at. But something like the first easing of a weight that had been there so long, it had started to feel like a structural feature of the body. The dawn arrived the way Montana dawn arrived in January. Slowly, reluctantly, the dark giving way to a gray that lightened in degrees rather than all at once, the mountains becoming visible by increments from the black bulk they'd been all night. Emily stood at the window and watched it for a while. She was running on no sleep and the particular kind of alertness that existed on the other side of exhaustion, where the thinking was clear but the body had gone quiet. She thought about the past 9 hours in sequence, the way you reviewed an operation, what had worked, what had almost failed, where the variables had been out of her control and where they hadn't. She thought about the side door and the badge and the pharmacy printout and Keeler's face on Renata's operative's phone. She thought about room 312 at 1047 when she'd pushed through the door into a room that was supposed to be too dangerous for a nurse who'd been on shift for 4 hours. And she'd stood still with her hands visible at her sides, and she'd spoken to a man who was still at war in a body that was in a hospital, and she'd just told him the truth. Not a protocol, not a script, just the truth, which was that his nervous system didn't know the difference between here and there, and that wasn't weakness, it was wiring. She thought about how small that moment was in the scope of what had come after it, and how everything that came after it had come from it. There was a lesson in that somewhere, though she was too tired to articulate it cleanly. Something about the cost of small decisions being higher than it appeared in the moment you made them. Something about how the things that changed everything rarely announced themselves as the thing that was going to change everything. She heard footsteps, and Renata appeared beside her at the window. "The charges," Renata said. "For what it's worth, on record, the charges against you from tonight. Unauthorized re-entry, trespassing on hospital property. The hospital administration will be formally asked to drop them, given the circumstances, and given that the chief physician who filed the termination order is now in federal custody." She paused. "That's going to happen today. And my nursing license?" "The Montana Board of Nursing will receive a federal communication today outlining the circumstances of your termination and re-entry. Your license is not in jeopardy." Renata looked at her sideways. "In fact, I suspect you're going to be difficult to terminate from anything for a while." Emily almost smiled. "Is that your professional assessment?" "That's my personal one." Renata turned from the window. "There's something else. I made a call earlier, before Holt, before the dispatch. I contacted the director of Summit Ridge Veterans Medical Center. It's a federal veterans facility, Fort Garrison, about 60 miles from here. They're fully staffed, but they've been trying to build a specialized trauma-informed care unit for veterans with combat stress presentations." She waited. "I told him what happened tonight. Not all of it. Some of it is going to be under seal for a while. But enough." Emily looked at her. "He asked me if the nurse who de-escalated a Special Forces veteran in a psychiatric hold and then spent the rest of the night preventing his murder would be interested in a conversation about a leadership position in that unit," Renata said. "I told him I didn't know. I told him I'd ask." The gray outside the window was lightening further. The mountains were fully visible now, the peaks still dark against a sky that was moving towards something that would eventually be blue. "Tell him yes," Emily said. Renata nodded. "Okay." The formal charging documents for Warren Price, the 2 Veritan executives, Marcus Holt, and the internal investigator were filed in federal court that morning. They were public filings, which meant they were accessible to anyone who knew to look, and by noon the details had begun moving through the channels by which these things moved. Federal reporters who covered DoD, military affairs journalists, legal analysts who spent their working lives reading charging documents. By 2 in the afternoon, Veritan Defense Solutions had been named in connection with the alleged deliberate compromise of a classified military operation resulting in the deaths of 7 U.S. service members. The company's stock, which had been trading at market open, halted at 147. An emergency statement from the company's communications office was contradicted within 40 minutes by documents already in the federal evidence chain. Emily watched none of this in real time. She was asleep in a hotel 3 blocks from Redstone Memorial, a room Renata had organized, a bed she'd sat on the edge of for exactly 90 seconds before lying down, and then nothing until 2:30 in the afternoon when her phone buzzed with enough persistence to surface her. The text was from Renata. Public disclosure moving. Your name is going to be in it. Wanted you to know before it hit. She lay on her back for a moment and looked at the ceiling. Her name. In a federal filing, connected to a case involving a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and a defense contractor, and a 6-year cover-up of the deaths of 7 soldiers. She thought about how that would read to the people who had trained her, the people whose names were attached to the classification block on her personnel file. She thought about whether any of them would be surprised. She thought briefly about whether surprised was the right word, and decided it probably wasn't. She got up, showered, found food at the diner across the street that was the kind of diner where breakfast was served all day, which was the kind of place she needed to be at 2:30 in the afternoon after no sleep. She sat in a booth by the window and ate eggs that were slightly overcooked and drank coffee that was not, and watched the street. Her phone rang. Not Renata, not Cole. A number with a Virginia area code that she didn't recognize. She answered. Miss Carter. A woman's voice, older, authoritative, without being aggressive. My name is Margaret Okafor. My son Darius was a member of Sergeant Ethan Cole's unit. Emily was very still. I've been contacted by a federal investigator named Renata Voss, Margaret Okafor said. She told me about the evidence, about what the records show. A pause. The kind that came from a person holding themselves together through deliberate effort. I've been waiting 8 years for someone to tell me the truth about what happened to my son. The official report never... She stopped. I believed something was wrong. I never stopped believing it. My family thought I was... Another stop. It doesn't matter what they thought. It does matter, Emily said. You were right. You kept believing something true. A silence. Renata said you were the one who found the evidence, that you went back into that hospital. I did the math on a medication chart, Emily said. The evidence was already there. Cole kept it for 6 years. But someone had to look. Margaret Okafor's voice was steady now, the steadiness of someone who'd been practicing this for years. Someone had to look, and you looked. Emily thought about what to say and settled on the thing that was true. Your son deserved to have someone look a long time ago. I'm sorry it took this long. She heard the other end of the line for a moment. Not words, just breath. Just the particular quality of a person receiving something they've needed for a long time. Thank you, Margaret Okafor said, for what you did. After she hung up, Emily sat in the diner booth for a while. The eggs were getting cold and she'd stopped noticing them. Outside the window, Ashford was having a regular January afternoon. Cars going by, people walking, the mountains visible above the rooftops in the long angled light of a winter sun. She thought about Darius Okafor, who she had never met and never would. She thought about the other 6. Diaz, Petrov, Walling, Marsh, Trent, Beaumont, and the families that Renata's team was contacting today. 8 years of silence breaking open in living rooms across however many states they'd come from. She thought about the fact that the truth didn't give anyone their person back. That was the part nobody said out loud in the official communications and the charging documents and the news coverage that was going to come. The truth was necessary, and it mattered, and it was owed, and it didn't give anyone back what they'd lost. But it was still necessary. It still mattered. It was still owed. She paid for her eggs and left. The days that followed were not dramatic. Federal proceedings were not dramatic. They were structured and detailed and moved at their own pace, which was not fast. Emily retained an attorney, a sharp-voiced woman named Selig, who had worked federal cases for 20 years and who read Emily's situation in about 10 minutes and said, "You're going to be fine, but it's going to take a while, and you need to let me handle the parts that aren't yours to handle." "What parts are mine?" Emily asked. "The testimony, the facts, what you saw, and what you did, and why you did it." Selig paused. "Everything else is mine." "Okay," Emily said. She gave her formal testimony in a federal proceeding 3 weeks after the events at Redstone Memorial. The courtroom was smaller than television made them appear. The air recycled and slightly stale, the furniture the particular shade of brown that government buildings had been painted since approximately 1987. She sat in the witness chair and answered questions for 6 hours across 2 days. The defense attorney for Marcus Holt tried, on the second day, to establish that Emily's military background, now partially disclosed as part of the classification review, gave her a pattern of acting outside sanctioned authority. That her actions at the hospital were a reflection of an embedded tendency toward insubordination rather than a legitimate medical intervention. Emily looked at him across the courtroom. "I re-entered the hospital," she said, "because a man was going to die in the next 40 minutes if I didn't. I did the math on his medication chart, and the math was unambiguous. Whether my background is characterized as a pattern of insubordination or a pattern of not leaving people to die when I have the capacity to stop it depends on who's doing the characterizing." A pause in the courtroom. "In this specific case," she said, "Sergeant Cole is alive. The evidence of a 6-year conspiracy is in federal court. 7 soldiers' families have the truth. I'll accept whatever characterization the record assigns to how that happened." Holt was convicted on 4 counts, including complicity in medical fraud and obstruction of federal investigation. He received 12 years. He did not look at Emily when the verdict was read. He looked at the table, and she thought about the 11 years Roberta had spent working under him and the particular cost of that specific kind of blindness. Warren Price pleaded not guilty and retained a team of attorneys who spent 4 months arguing about the scope of the evidence chain. The arguments failed. The financial records connected him to the operational compromise with a directness that no amount of legal architecture could obscure. He received 22 years. He was 61 years old when the sentence was handed down, and the math of it was its own kind of answer. The 2 Veritan executives, a man named Darroch and a woman named Passel, received sentences of 18 and 15 years respectively on charges that included conspiracy, financial crimes connected to military contracting, and the most serious charge, which was complicity in an operation that had resulted in the deliberate deaths of U.S. service members. The language of that charge, when it was read in court, was something Emily sat with for a long time afterward. Not because it was surprising, because hearing it said out loud in a legal proceeding by a federal attorney on record was different from knowing it. The Harwick Group operatives were identified and charged over a span of 6 weeks, 11 people in total. They received varying sentences. The one who had been at the fence gap, whose name turned out to be Sorrells, received the longest, primarily because Renata's team connected him to a prior operation with similar characteristics. The internal investigator, a man named Falk, who had been inside Renata's investigation for 14 months, quietly managing what information surfaced and what didn't, received 8 years. He cooperated extensively in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his cooperation was what closed the remaining gaps in the evidentiary chain, connecting Price to Veritan to Harwick to the specific decision made 6 years earlier to provide coordinates to an external network. Ethan Cole's official military record was formally amended 6 weeks after the initial arrests. The amendment was reviewed by 3 separate DoD offices and signed by a general Emily never met, and it corrected the official after-action report for Vortex 6 to reflect that the unit had been deliberately compromised rather than the victim of faulty intelligence. 7 service records were corrected simultaneously. Cole called Emily when it happened. "It's official," he said. "I know. Renata sent me the paperwork." A pause. "How does it feel from your end?" She thought about it honestly. "Like it should have been done 8 years ago, and like it matters that it's done now." "Yeah," he said. "Both things." "How are you?" Another pause, the considering kind. "I'm working on it. That's the accurate answer." He paused again. "The families of the 7. I've been in contact with all of them now, not just the Okafors. All 7 families. A breath. That's been, it's been hard, and it's been the right thing. Both of those things at the same time. Yeah, she said. Both things. She started at Summit Ridge Veterans Medical Center on a Tuesday in March, 8 weeks after the night at Redstone Memorial. She drove the 60 miles from Ashford in the morning, the mountains on her left side, the sky doing the thing that Montana skies did in March when the winter was loosening its grip. Not spring yet, not even close, but the light had changed in a way that registered. The director, a man named Calloway, who was somewhere in his 50s and had the specific tiredness of someone who had been fighting for funding for a specialized program for a long time, met her in the parking lot. Not the lobby, the parking lot, which she appreciated. They walked the perimeter of the facility while he talked about the trauma-informed care unit and what he was trying to build and where the program had stalled. We have good people, he said. We have the medical expertise. What we've been missing is someone who understands both sides of it. The clinical piece and the other piece. The part that isn't on any chart, Emily said. That part? Yes. He looked at her sideways. Renata Voss told me you walked into a room with a Special Forces veteran in acute stress response, and you got him calm in under 10 minutes. I knew what I was looking at, Emily said. Most people in that hallway didn't. That's the gap, Calloway said. That's the thing we can't fill with more clinical training alone. He stopped walking. I want to be honest with you. This position comes with administrative headaches and funding fights and paperwork and a bureaucracy that is not designed to move quickly. It's not clean, Emily said. He looked at her. The work, she said. It's not going to be clean and easy. I know that. I haven't been looking for clean. He held her gaze for a moment. No, he said. I don't suppose you have. She started the following Monday. The unit was small. 6 beds, 2 additional staff, a room that was still being outfitted when she arrived. She spent the first week in meetings about protocols and staff coordination and the specific way Summit Ridge handled its documentation system, which was different from Redstone's system in ways that required more adjustment than she'd anticipated. She made a mistake in the medication documentation on day 3. A categorization error, minor, caught immediately, corrected. And she documented the error herself and reported it the way you were supposed to, and nobody said anything about it except to confirm the correction. She thought about Holt, briefly, and what a different world it would have been if he'd been the kind of person who did that. She thought that a lot, actually. What kind of world it would be if the people with authority over others treated the correction of mistakes as a professional obligation rather than a threat to their position. She didn't have a solution to that, because there wasn't a clean one. But she thought about it enough that it started to inform how she ran the unit. The kind of culture she tried to create in a room that had 6 beds and 2 staff members, and was still getting its furniture arranged. The first patient admitted to the unit under her formal leadership was a woman, a combat medic who had served 2 tours and came in presenting with what had been mischaracterized at a previous facility as an anxiety disorder. Emily read her chart and talked to her for an hour and went back to her desk and rewrote the care plan from the ground up. You changed the whole approach, her intake nurse said, looking over her shoulder. The previous approach was wrong, Emily said. Not because the previous clinicians were bad, because they were looking at what she was showing them instead of what was producing it. Which is? Emily looked at the care plan. She's not anxious, she said. She's hypervigilant. There's a difference. And the treatment approach for one is actively counterproductive for the other. The intake nurse was quiet for a moment. How do you know which is which? You ask, Emily said, and you listen to the whole answer, not just the part that fits the diagnosis you walked in with. Simple. Not easy. Both things at the same time. On a Friday afternoon in April, 8 weeks into the job, Emily was finishing notes in the unit's small office when a member of the administrative staff knocked and said there was someone in the lobby asking for her, not a patient, not a family member of a patient. She walked out. Roberta Stills was standing in the lobby of Summit Ridge Veterans Medical Center, wearing her civilian clothes, which Emily realized she'd never seen before. A dark coat, sensible shoes, looking smaller out of her scrubs and still entirely herself. Emily stopped when she saw her. I'm not here for anything specific, Roberta said quickly. I just, She stopped. I heard where you were. Calloway is a colleague of a colleague, and I needed to say something I didn't get to say that night. Emily waited. When you came to this floor, Roberta said, I treated you the way Marcus Holt treated you. Not as bad, but in the same direction. She looked at Emily steadily, the way she had in the break room at 3 in the morning. You'd been there 4 hours and I'd already decided what you were. A transfer. Someone temporary. Someone who didn't know how things worked. You were tired, Emily said. Double shift energy. That's not an excuse. No, Emily agreed, but it's a reason. Roberta looked at her for a long moment, then, you went back in that building. Yeah. After he fired you. After he humiliated you in front of everyone on that floor. She shook her head slightly. I watched you walk to that elevator and I said your name and I didn't… She stopped. I should have said more. Emily thought about that elevator ride, the math in her head, the parking lot and the cold and the decision. You said my name, Emily said. That was something. Roberta looked like she wanted to argue with that, and then decided not to. I've applied for a transfer, she said, to a veterans facility. Different from this one. There's one opening closer to where I live. I thought, I've been a medical surgical nurse for 19 years, and I think maybe it's time I did something I don't already know how to do. Emily looked at her. At the woman who had been 53 and tired and decided in 20 minutes, and who had, at 3 in the morning, told a man under federal detention that she hadn't seen anything all evening and held his gaze the whole time. You already know more than you think you do, Emily said. Roberta left 20 minutes later, back to wherever she'd parked, and Emily stood in the Summit Ridge lobby for a moment after the automatic doors closed behind her. The lobby was quiet, afternoon light coming through the west-facing windows. Someone down the hall was talking in the low, even tones of a person speaking to a patient. A phone rang at the desk and was answered immediately. Emily had been dismissed from Redstone Memorial at 11:14 on a Tuesday night, 4 hours into her first shift, by a man who had looked at her badge and decided he already knew everything he needed to know about what she was and what she was capable of. She had walked to the parking lot in the Montana cold, and she had done the math, and she had made a choice. That was the whole story, in one sense. A woman who did the math and made the choice. But the math was built from 8 years of things that couldn't be put on a badge. And the choice was built from the knowledge that there are moments when the cost of not acting is paid by someone who had nothing to do with the calculation. She understood that specific truth in a way that was not comfortable and not clean and not something she'd asked to understand. She'd understood it since long before nursing school, in places that didn't appear on any map, in rooms that were darker than hospital break rooms at 3 in the morning. The difference now was that she used it for this. For a 6-bed unit in a veterans medical center in Montana, where the patients came in with damage that had been misread and mislabeled and undertreated, and where the work was to look at what was actually there instead of what was easiest to categorize. Not clean, not easy. Necessary, the way few things in her life had been necessary in the clear and uncomplicated way this was. She walked back down the hall toward the unit. There was a care plan on her desk that needed finishing before end of day. There was a patient in room 3 who had a follow-up evaluation in the morning that she wanted to prepare for tonight. There was work to do. She did it. And that was enough. Not as a consolation, not as a settling for something smaller than what she'd wanted, but as the real thing, the actual thing, the kind of enough that people spend entire lives looking for, and sometimes, if they're paying attention, eventually find. The woman they had dismissed was still here. She had always been here. She had simply been waiting for the right room to walk into.